All right. Good evening. It's great to see that some of you actually survived. My name is Navin Suthahar. I am from the Department of Cardiology, Erasmus Medical Center, Rotterdam, the Netherlands. I have no conflict of interest for this speech. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but I just move on. So I was reading this interesting article in Nature Reviews Endocrinology 2 weeks ago. It talks about obesity and how it has become rampant. So let's focus on the right end, right corner. That's the total world. When we have more time or when you're bored, you can take a look at all these subcategories. It's very interesting. But I was a little concerned when I took a look at the right-hand side of men and women. During the last 20 years or so, or maybe 30, maybe 35, we have a 3x increase in obesity. And now we have to put that in perspective with the 2x increase in population and look at the massive burden of obesity that we are having today. And the thing is, well, terrible news, it's going to continue. There are some countries fighting to be number one. So it's something that's largely ignored, but it's going to be the next biggest problem, let's say in the 20 to 30 years. It's a huge burden on healthcare, and it's a risk factor for so many diseases, including heart failure. So today I'm going to speak about obesity and heart failure, obesity-related heart failure. My topic is a little more chilled. It's no acute setting, no emergency setting, no acute heart failure. It's a couple of general population studies and one stable heart failure patients. So it's not about diagnosis, it's about biology, and it's about prediction. Well, we probably know all of this. There are many mechanisms that we know of heart failure and obesity. Reduced physical exercise, psychological factors, very important. People ignore it. It's that probably causes obesity in many and also continues to other problems, obesity-related conditions like type 2 diabetes, hypertension, pulmonary mechanisms, cardiovascular disease like MI, AF. All are obesity-related conditions that can lead to heart failure. Well, what we focus a little bit more when we go further is cardiac hemodynamics, structure, function, cardiac lipotoxicity. There's even a theory that, individuals with extreme obesity, their heart kind of changes from muscle to fat. And then obesity-related myocardial damage, inflammation, oxidative stress. Now, speaking about the last 2 points, how do we get that information from obesity-related myocardial damage, inflammation, oxidative stress? From biomarkers. For instance, troponin can give an example of how much myocardial damage is there in individuals with obesity, inflammation, CRP, and so on. That's when biomarkers come into play, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So focusing on protein biomarkers related to obesity and heart failure. I mentioned this before. So let's start with a general population study. This is the PREVENT study. It is something like the Framingham Heart Study from the northern part of Netherlands, from Groningen. It's general population, 8,200 individuals. We published this, I think, a couple of years ago. So it's 8,200 individuals, relatively young people, 49 years, 50% women, 41% overweight in a country like Netherlands, and 16% obese. And we had a follow-up of 11 years and 357 heart failure events. Well, how does obesity impact levels of heart failure biomarkers? These are 13 classic biomarkers measured via ELISA techniques. So to give perspective, I'm adding this slide. So we measured all these 13 biomarkers that everybody talks about, NPs, cardiac troponins, endothelin-1, PI-1, CRP, etc. for inflammation, galectin-3 for fibrosis, adrenomedullin, everybody knows that. So we said, how do they relate to obesity in PREVENT studies? So that's the answer. Except for natriuretic peptides, which are lower in individuals with obesity, almost everything else is positive. So increased troponin T, indicating myocardial damage, and all the other biomarkers reflecting inflammation and fibrosis. So that's a very good hinge point for us to have our discussion today. Well, we know that. To add another example, there was a previous study called Obesity, Subclinical Myocardial Injury and Incident Heart Failure, again with troponin T. So maybe there is some obesity-related myocardial injury after all. Well, now Framingham Heart Study. So these are relative measures. These are not ELISA measures. So this is one point I thought I should mention to you today. So now people have this great theory. If NT-proBNP is low in individuals with obesity, its predictive value is lower in individuals with obesity. No, absolutely not. It has nothing to do with the predictive value. Just like we make a hypothesis saying NT-proBNP levels are higher in women, it has a higher predictive value in women. No, we just kind of destroyed that theory in this study, but that's for future. We can discuss it over later in the evening. It's even there in guidelines, unfortunately. But coming back to our topic today, this is the Framingham Heart Study. And here they measured all these cardiovascular biomarkers, but not in absolute terms, but in relative terms, something like an O-link panel. Again, you see 71 biomarkers measured, approximately same 50% women, 49 years, but 26% with obesity, much more than in the Netherlands, 10% higher in the United States population. 41 were related with obesity. Here's a huge list. You can read it later when you have time, but for us to just focus on. Of the biomarkers positively related to obesity, leptin, CRP, PI1, and adrenomedulin were the most important. Likewise, amongst the negatively associated, NT-proBNP and the IGF-BP family, more or less in line with our previous study. So this assay actually works in that population. Now, this is the focus for today, obesity-related proteins in heart failure patients. So this is stable HFrEF patients, 373. Multiple, 4,000, greater than 4,000 proteins were measured using the SOMA logic, and multiple measures were made. So we're talking about more than 3 measurements. And mean age of 63 years, 25% women, of course, HFrEF, much more male predominant, 25% obese, followed up for 2.1 years. Now, what do we see here? These are associations. There were approximately of these 4,250 proteins associated positively or negatively with obesity. We cannot go through all of them, but again, hinge point. CRP positively related, NT-proBNP negative, troponin neutral, fatty acid binding protein, which is something of heart. So that's something related to troponin. So that's positively related. So there were multiple proteins positively or negatively related, and it works. So among these proteins that were positively or negatively related with obesity, we saw which one was associated with outcomes, adverse clinical outcomes in heart failure patients, kind of taking the gold out from some electronic items. So we're kind of, reducing it. So we have, again, approximately, I would say, 30 proteins which were associated with outcome. Amongst these, some important proteins, which I don't want to go through now. But what we did additionally, okay, well, maybe we can just go through very briefly. So another point I would like to make here. So there is no logic here. We cannot make an assumption that a protein is negatively related to obesity means it's a good protein, and a protein that's positively associated with obesity is a bad protein. Nothing like that. Maybe what I would dare to say is if a protein is positively associated with obesity and also positively associated with outcome, maybe it is a bad protein. But we can't say anything regarding the others. For instance, NT-proBNP. It's negatively related to protein, but it's positively related to outcome. And it's a good guy, BNP. So no logic there. But just to put perspective, I would focus on the positive associations. So that would be insulin growth factor binding protein cleavage molecule, that's HTRA1, fatty acid binding protein, and a DNA repair protein that is associated with senescence and PI1. So these are the proteins that I would focus on. Now, what we did additionally is we not only used all the time points, it's joint models, it's a pretty complex modeling. What we did is we did not just take into consideration the temporal evolution of all these 4,000 biomarkers, but we also adjusted for multiple factors, including NT-proBNP, temporally. So we adjusted for the complete evolution of NT-proBNP. So these are very harsh adjustments. So what results come out probably is quite useful. So what we see again here is, can we go back one slide, please? Yeah, so again, what we see is, except for the fatty acid binding protein, the cardiac one, all the other 4 proteins were actually significantly associated with outcome. Now, why? Because they were not that related to NT-proBNP. That's why they survived. So they are indicative of other pathophysiologic pathways that are not captured by NT-proBNP. So conclusions, well, we can use all these sophisticated protein studies to see the pathophysiology of obesity-related heart failure. That is a possibility. We can use some of these proteins for prediction. And some of these proteins also have some predictive value above and beyond the temporal evolution of NT-proBNP. And these are, for instance, serine protease, HTRA1, DNA repair protein, and PI1. Other proteins of interest are fatty acid binding protein 4 and the IGF-BP family. Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much. For me, it was a rather complex talk. Yeah, please.
I have to apologize. I'm a hepatologist. I'm going to ask you a hepatology question. Is there any correlation between NASH and heart failure in the obese patients? Because the mode of exodus of patients with NASH, with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, is not the liver. It's actually congestive heart failure.
Well, that's a great question. Me personally, I've never looked into it. And I'm not sure if any of these biomarkers also reflect NASH, but we do have the NASH endpoint in the PREVENT study and the Rotterdam study. Maybe it's worthy to look into it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I also have a question, if nobody in the audience. So I'm from the lab, so I was a bit triggered by your comment that you were talking about bad and good markers or proteins. So I was wondering if you don't like the confounding part with biomarkers, then I think we can close our lab because most of the biomarkers do have impact, for example, obesity, but you have more other confounding factors too. So I was wondering if you thought about a solution of this, and or should we wait for AI that maybe we not use the biomarker as a biomarker anymore, but more go to a complex prediction model? So
No, we must use biomarkers. We must apply our thinking and our intelligence. But what I wanted to say is not a very simplistic point of view. So for instance, if a biomarker is reduced in obesity, it does not automatically make it into a good biomarker or a bad biomarker. We have to use that information, use our intelligence, and kind of maybe discuss it and see if it actually makes logical sense along with the biological experiment before we rapidly conclude anything. So that was kind of my message. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Very great presentations and the issues. I would like to ask whether in this study you differentiate the subtypes of heart failure. Is it like what you said, it's stable heart failure patient? Do you have any data or differentiation between those with preserved or reduced indifference of the proteins that been presented in this subtypes of heart failure group? Do you have any comment on that or maybe data?
I do have, yes, absolutely. So these are HFrEF patients, and we measured 4,000 proteins in multiple time points. That's very expensive, actually. So we do have data of HFpEF patients and so on. But what I also look for is maybe some other people also measured using the SOMA logic. So it's good to put all these data together, maybe in a different heart failure setting. So what I showed was HFrEF, and that's why it was also predominantly men. But we do have for HFpEF as well. Yeah.
thank you so much.
Thank you.